Welcome to week 3, everyone. One of my favorite comments from this past week was that there was too much in those readings to be able to fit all that someone wanted to say in their 300-word response in the forum. And I hope you continue to have that problem as the class progresses, because of course I've tried to select readings that are going to stimulate all kinds of directions of thought for you and allow our class just to be one sliver of that, and maybe not ask it to be more, because I think the subject matter of our class, of course, calls for a whole life of learning in response. The readings by Wendell Berry and Ellen Davis that we did this past week generated a variety of, I think, really fabulous responses. We've had some good back and forth, some of us. And I think that it's understandable that given our cultural, economic, ecological inheritance, the kind of life that Berry and Davis call for, the kind that they find presented to us as God's calling for us in Scripture, will seem in many ways very remote. Perhaps it will come off as hopelessly romantic. And there may be some ways in which that criticism sticks. And so I'm open to further conversation along those lines. But I hope that you've begun to perceive that they are not engaged, writers like them, in a sort of superficial analysis of what is good and bad about the ecological patterns that we have inherited. They're instead engaged in a deep and searching description of the human and the earth, of course, is integrally related to one another. And those descriptions challenge a whole range of assumptions and habits that we have acquired simply, for the most part, by living in our time and our places. And so I hope you'll continue to sort of sink yourself into the kinds of agrarian descriptions that writers like Berry and Davis are giving to us, because without taking the thickness of that description seriously, I don't think that we will feel the pressure that we need to when it comes to some of the specific issues that they are raising for scrutiny. So this means thinking about the body, for example, in an intricate and intimate relation to not just its place and landscape, but the kinds of social dynamics that make bodily life what it is, and how those social dynamics are related to the land and place that shapes the life that we live. One of the difficulties that both of them are pointing to is that the sort of life that we have inherited is in many respects virtually oblivious to the places where we live, so that the basic habits of our life are not meaningfully distinct often across great differences in landscape and differences in history and place Instead, there's a sort of relatively homogeneous urban pattern of life that is characteristic of a sort of post-industrialized age in places like the United States. And consequently, we are mostly apt to engage our places and to develop social practices or institutions in relation to our places, where those places are primarily maybe objects of contemplation, a lot of sentimentality. You definitely see this in the way people talk about nature or the wilderness today, and not an experience or formation in place where the actual stuff of our bodies and minds are the product of that intricate, dynamic interaction with the places that we inhabit. So it's that more kind of deeply placed life that both Barry and Davis are calling us to, are attributing also to the teaching of Scripture, and inviting us to ask hard social questions, economic questions, in light of that sort of divorce that now characterizes the way that we relate to the places that we inhabit. And it's not an easy subject, obviously. No pat answers or the like for how to receive or address the kind of criticism that they're delivering to us. But I hope that it's food for your thoughts, so that you're not just thinking about how we relate to what we intuitively think of as nature, but how the habits of your life and the social dynamics that shape your life to be what it is, how those relate to land and to place. This is going to become increasingly a focus for us when we return from the wilderness and begin to direct our gaze to the places that we live in light of the experience that we've had in the wilderness, asking how it is teaching us, perhaps how God is teaching us through that experience in the wilderness to live in our places, but especially how that involves the way we relate to our neighbors, the kinds of social institutions that we are committed to and why, what kinds of economic patterns we want to promote and why. Those are going to be the sort of searching questions that we pursue more when we come back from being in the Weminuche together in Colorado. I hope that you're taking seriously the fact that I mean for Scripture to be a constant companion of us. We were helped this past week by having Ellen Davis talk very specifically about Exodus, and especially the manna gift of God in the narrative and all that is being taught to us through that part of the book of Exodus. But in future weeks, like the one that's coming, we will not always have writers, secondary writers, that are tending directly to the biblical text. But I hope that won't minimize the attention that you give to the biblical text as what we want to remain an authoritative companion and guide for us as we read other sources. When I say authoritative companion and guide, I don't mean that the content of Scripture is sort of fixed and then we pull out of it to apply to other things. We will, of course, be drawing from Scripture as we're reading it, but I also mean for our own ear, for what Scripture is saying, to be affected by the other writings that we're encountering, the voices that we're hearing. So the actual content of the biblical witness itself, since it is mediated by the way that we interpret it, should be affected by the other readings that we have as a sort of source of learning for us. Now, this is especially important for us going into next week's reading. This is the main textbook that we'll be reading for the next 2 weeks, roughly the first half this next week and then the second half the following week. It's called Trace. It's by Laurette Savoy. The subtitle is Memory, History, Race, and the American Landscape. This is a thoughtful book that I don't want us to rush through. You'll see in the prompt that I've written for the discussion forum this week that I really want you to find some ways to be able to enjoy this book and just kind of take it as it comes to you. Maybe to find some of those nourishing places that appeared in our videos last week in which to read this book. But I only have assigned one response for this week, just one forum, because I don't want this week to be too taxing for you. There's a relatively significant number of pages, I suppose, of reading, but I don't think that you'll find it to be super heavy reading. And mostly I want you to maybe take some of what was said last week in several of our videos, as well as the reading about the importance of rest, and to try to incorporate the reading of this coming week into your life in a way that provides also some space for you to rest and to soak in what you have read in those times and places of rest, and to see how that might allow the voice of this book to be taken up by God's own voice and power and impressed upon you, and hopefully generate some meaningful reflection from you. So I look forward to perhaps a little bit more of kind of less is more this week in terms of what is required of you, and some space as a result for you to be able to ponder and just think through how this book is washing over you. We'll still have the same amount of comments in our replies to other people's responses in the discussion forum, and I hope that will be the place where we can begin to pursue even more conversation about the themes that are taking shape in our class. As I said at the beginning of the video, I'm thrilled that you're finding the readings to be too much or too rich to be able to capture in short responses. And part of the reason, I think, for that is that the heart of this class is the immersion experience that is coming up shortly here. We're going to be leaving from here in Pasadena, I know, in just, about 11 days. So it's knocking on our door, but that experience together of 8 or 9 days in Colorado, 5 of them in a rather intense communion on the trail, is going to give us really some extended time to be quiet, of course, but also just to talk with one another about what we will have read by then. So I hope that what you're not able to include in these brief forum responses will come through in the conversations that we'll be having when we're trekking through the Weminuche wilderness together in just a couple weeks from now. So God bless your reading and your learning this week. I look forward to reading